Last season in the Championship, we had some brilliantly clinical forwards, and that got me thinking, who was the most clinical player from each Championship club last season? Well, I've gone ahead and crunched the numbers to figure out who each Championship club's most clinical player from last season was, and in today's video, we're going to be ranking them all based on their goals per shot ratio. So to qualify as your team's most clinical player, you needed to take at least 30 shots last season, and you needed to have your club's best goals per shot ratio. I've then formulated them all into a 1 to 24 table, and without any further ado, let's jump into it. So coming in at the bottom of the list as Hull's most clinical player from last season, we have Keane Lewis Potter coming in with a goals per shot ratio of 0.12. Now this isn't a knock at Lewis Potter that he's bottom of the list. It's actually quite impressive that he was Hull's most clinical player from last season, considering he played a lot of this season out wide and actually as a wing back, and as a result of that, a lot of his shots would have been from low probable areas. But I think it was quite clear early on that, you know, McGuinness wasn't quite up to Championship standard. Eves, while he was a handful, wasn't exactly prolific in front of goal, and Keane Lewis Potter was exactly that in his first season. Got into double figures, and with that sort of conversion rate as a wing back, I think he's only going to go on and get better next season. Norwich City's Teemu Pukki also comes in with a goals per shot ratio of 0.12. He was Norwich's most clinical player from last season in the Premier League. Obviously these numbers will be slightly skewed by the fact that Pukki was playing in the Premier League and he's, you know, ranked alongside players who are playing in the Championship from last season. Norwich generally struggled for creativity, and Pukki really was one of the only shining lights in that side from last season. As of recording, it's just coming out as well that Pukki is potentially looking for a way out of Carrow Road this summer, which would be an absolutely massive blow for Norwich. But yeah, there's no doubting he is, for me, still Norwich's most important player. West Brom's Karlan Grant is up next with a goals per shot ratio of 0.13. It became a little bit of a meme last season of how wasteful West Brom actually were in front of goal. Grant did pop up with 18 goals in the end for West Brom. He was their top scorer, but a hell of a lot of missed chances along the way, not just for Grant, but for the vast majority of that forward line for West Brom. We thought the antidote might have been Daryl Dike coming in January, but he then picked up that injury and was then ruled out for the rest of the season. West Brom have already had quite the reshuffle in terms of the incomings into that forward line next season, and the likes of Grant with DK back to full fitness next season alongside Jed Wallace and John Swift. It's quite the forward line, you have to say. Next up we then have Rotherham United's Freddie Ladapo, who was their most clinical player from their League One campaign last season with a goals per shot ratio of 0.15. He's no longer at Rotherham, and you have to admit Rotherham have lost quite the bulk of their goals from their League One campaign last season. Ladapo will be at Ipswich next season, and Michael Smith, who finished as their top scorer with 19 goals, will be playing for Sheffield Wednesday. They have made a few moves in this department with the incomings of Connor Washington and Tom Eves as well, and they'll have quite the job on their hands to replace the goals that they've lost in those two players. Stoke's most clinical player last season was actually Lewis Baker, who came in January. He's also got a goals per shot ratio of 0.15. 8 goals scored, some absolute worldies along the way, a master at shooting from outside the box, and considering how many pop shots he actually takes, the fact that he was Stoke's most clinical player last season is quite the statement, to be fair. Generally speaking, Cardiff struggled for goals last season, but their most clinical player was actually Ruben Colwill with a goals per shot ratio of 0.16. He finished the season with 5 goals. Actually, no Cardiff player ended last season in double figures, but Colwill is someone who I am excited to see more of heading into next season. It's been quite the busy transfer window already for Cardiff, but I'm sure that Colwill is going to be a player who's front and centre of them moving forward. Shane Lavery started last season like an absolute house on fire for Blackpool, and he actually ended this season as their most clinical player with a goals per shot ratio of 0.16. He had that point in the season though where he picked up that injury, and then after that was sort of in and out of the side. The second half of the season it seemed to be the preferred two up front, a little bit more so was Jerry Yates next to Gary Medine, but 8 goals in his first season in the Championship is certainly nothing to be sniffed at for Lavery. Watford's Emmanuel Dennis actually had a pretty respectable goals per shot ratio of 0.16 in the Premier League. He ended the season with 10 goals, 6 assists, and seems to be the next departure out of Watford, which was probably to be expected. Dennis was one of the few players probably from that Watford squad who could end the season with his head held high. Next up then we have Coventry's Matty Godden with a goals per shot ratio of 0.17. How many goals would have Godden realistically got last season had he not been injured for as long as he was? He only started 17 championship matches last season and still managed to come up with 12 goals in that time period, which is seriously impressive. At one point last season, Ben Brereton Diaz was the most clinical player in the championship, and he still finished last season with a pretty respectable goals per shot ratio of 0.17. By far and away Blackburn's most consistent finisher from last season. Be very interesting to see what the future holds for the Chilean. Danny Ward was Huddersfield's most clinical finisher from last season, coming in with a goals per shot ratio of 0.18. It didn't quite feel like Huddersfield were solely reliant on one or two players from last season. It felt very much like a collective effort of that group, but Danny Ward came up with several important goals for Huddersfield, chipped in with 14 of them throughout the season. Reading's Lucas João is up next with a goals per shot ratio of 0.18. We've spoken about Lucas João in quite a few of the most recent transfer rumour roundup videos. Where would Reading be over the last few years had it not been for his goals? He was only fit enough to start 21 championship matches last season, but still managed to find his way into double figures with 10 goals. We've spoken about his importance to this Reading side heading into next season, and I stand by what I've said about João in previous videos. I think Reading have to do everything they can to keep hold of him. Next then we have Sheffield United's Iliman Ndiaye, who actually finished the season as their most clinical player with a goals per shot ratio of 0.19. Obviously Sheffield United had quite the crisis during the second half of the season with all the injuries that accumulated in the top end of the pitch. In the end it ended up being sort of Ndiaye and Gibbs-White bouncing off each other as that forward too, but it feels like Ndiaye at his age is only going to go on and continue to get better, and I back him to be even more important for Sheffield United heading into next season, particularly with that sort of clinical ability. After that, we then have Preston North End's Emile Reece coming in with a goals per shot ratio of 0.19. Seriously impressive stuff from Reece last season. 16 goals in the Championship. I think that his goals are going to be even more vital for North End next season, with the unlikelihood that we'll get Cameron Archer back. But with Reece, it feels like season upon season, he's going to be a player who continues to develop and get better. Someone who can stretch the back line, get in behind, use his pace, and also has a knack for scoring goals from quite unlikely situations, and that shows how clinical he can be from those areas. Maxwell Cornet's goal per shot ratio of 0.2 is especially impressive considering he was playing in the Premier League as a winger last season. Burnley seriously missed him while he was away at AFCON, and I mean, I for one would love to see a player like Cornet in the Championship for next season. It seems more than likely that he will be a player who probably does get moved on when a big bid does come in for him, but 25 years old, 9 goals in the Premier League last season. He would be a player who could be a game changer for Burnley if he was to stick around. I think that Middlesbrough strikers last season were arguably their least clinical player, so it will come as no surprise to learn that Matt Crooks was actually Middlesbrough's most clinical finisher last season with a goals per shot ratio of 0.21. Borough had quite a few issues with consistency amongst their strikers, but one player who would turn up week in, week out and was always good for a goal was Matt Crooks. Finished the season with 10 goals, which is impressive. For Luton Town, it was Elijah Adebayo who stole a lot of the headlines last season, but it was actually Harry Cornick who was their most clinical finisher if we are judging it off goals per shot, with Cornick coming in with a goals per shot ratio of 0.22. Cornick often seen as the sort of supporting act to Adebayo, but certainly shouldn't be underestimated. He chipped in with 12 goals last season, which was a healthy return. Scott Hogan was Birmingham's most clinical player last season, coming in with a goals per shot ratio of 0.22, which actually really quite surprised me. He was Birmingham's top scorer from last season, the only player within that Blues squad to pop up with double figures, scoring 10 goals. And to be honest, considering he only just averages over a shot per game, it was pretty good going that he actually got into double figures in the end. Millwall's Tom Bradshaw actually went quite under the radar last season with how clinical he actually was for Millwall, with a goals per shot ratio of 0.23, which ranks him amongst the most clinical strikers in the Championship championship from last season. Of course, he did miss a large chunk of last season through injury. He only started 16 championship matches, which is even more impressive considering he scored 9 goals and got an assist in that time. Another striker who went fairly under the radar last season was QPR's Andre Gray. Obviously, he's no longer at the club, but spent last season out on loan at QPR, but with a goals per shot ratio of 0.24, certainly nothing to be sniffed at. He only started 13 championship matches, had 15 appearances in off the bench, and still managed to come up with 10 goals last season for QPR, which was fairly impressive. Swansea's most clinical player last season was Michael Obafemi with a goals per shot ratio of 0.24. Seriously impressive stuff considering he realistically missed the vast majority of the first half of the season. Swansea had 3 players in particular who ranked really high up in terms of the most clinical players in the championship from last season. Obafemi, Patterson and Perrault all showed up really well in this regard, but Obafemi just took it as Swansea's most clinical player from last season. Will Keane was one of League One's most clinical players from last season, and he was Wigan's most clinical outlet with a seriously impressive goals per shot ratio of 0.25. Wigan's top scorer last season with 26 goals, 7 assists to go along with that as well. Will Keane's always been someone who is sort of flat to deceive in the championship, and so this time around with Wigan, a club where he really seems to be settled in at, is a season I suppose to prove people wrong that he can cut it at this level. If you asked Andy Weimann to do a job at centre half, I reckon he could do it, to be honest, and he was Bristol City's most clinical player in the championship last season, and actually the most clinical player in the championship overall with a goals per shot ratio of 0.27. Weimann played pretty much every position across the pitch last season for Bristol City, came up with 22 goals as well as 10 assists in that time period. He was unbelievably clinical, and that was probably the best season of his career. But claiming the #1 spot as the most clinical player on today's video, we actually have Sunderland's Nathan Broadhead, who comes in with a whopping goals per shot ratio of 0.29 from last season, making him the most clinical player from League One last season and the most clinical player on today's video. Ross Stewart may have been Sunderland's top scorer last season with 26 goals, but Broadhead was their most clinical outlet. He scored 10 goals, and I'm sure they'll be absolutely desperate to get him back from Everton next season in the championship. But guys, there we have it. There was every championship club's most clinical player from last season and how they all rank up amongst each other. Who are you backing going into next season to be your club's most clinical player and your top scorer in general? I'd be interested to know. As always though, if you did go on to enjoy, make sure to leave a like and do stay tuned for some regular championship content. Thanks for watching though guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.